May 4, 1945. Tangermünde Bridge, Elbe River. The wrecked steel frame of the bridge strained and shivered as thousands of German soldiers and civilians picked their way across what remained of the structure. The span had been blown apart by retreating Wehrmacht engineers on April 12, yet its twisted skeleton now formed the last fragile route westward. What had once been a modern river crossing was reduced to a narrow path of broken slabs and warped metal suspended above the Elbe. American intelligence monitoring the 102nd Infantry Division sector intercepted urgent signals. German forces were abandoning all positions. Reports estimated nearly 100,000 troops and civilians were moving toward U.S. lines, fighting through chaos and destroyed infrastructure in a desperate attempt to escape the advancing Soviets. Captain William Patterson, 405th Infantry Regiment, lowered his binoculars and studied the endless human tide struggling over the shattered bridge. 2 weeks earlier, American units had reached the Elbe and halted at the agreed boundary established at Yalta. No one had predicted that this ruined crossing would become the focal point of the largest voluntary mass surrender ever seen on the Western Front. The motive driving this flood of humanity was brutally simple: survival. German intelligence had already intercepted Soviet communications outlining mortality expectations for captured Wehrmacht troops. The numbers were stark. Out of every 100 prisoners taken by the Red Army, fewer than 40 were expected to return alive. The reality would prove even worse. Meanwhile, over 8 million German civilians fled west from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, trying to outrun the Soviet war machine as Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konyev crushed the last organized German defenses. Soviet spearheads were advancing 30 kilometers per day, while refugee columns barely managed 10. Within this collapsing world, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final strategic memorandum, captured after the German surrender, contained a single directive underlined for emphasis. Maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. It was not a plea for victory, nor a plan for bargaining. It was recognition of one truth: to surrender to the Americans meant a chance to live. To fall into Soviet hands meant something far different. Across the Western Bank, American forces prepared for an unprecedented crisis. Unlike the collapsing German formations, the U.S. Army sat atop a vast logistical machine capable of absorbing chaos. Each American infantry division had military police detachments, mobile field kitchens capable of feeding thousands, and medical teams equipped for battlefield surgery. Their supplies, fuel, medicine, water, and food were stocked in quantities Europe had not seen since the war began. Major James Morrison, operations officer of the 102nd Infantry Division, had already studied the nightmare of mass capitulation during the Ruhr Pocket, where 325,000 Germans had surrendered in mid-April. His notes were chillingly specific. 1,000 prisoners required around 3 tons of food per day, thousands of gallons of drinking water, medical inspections, delousing operations, and an avalanche of paperwork, 12 documents per man, to comply with the Geneva Convention. Meeting those standards could mean the difference between life and riot-level desperation. The German forces stumbling toward the Elbe were a cross-section of a dying army. Elite Waffen-SS detachments still carried functioning Tiger tanks. Regular Wehrmacht divisions had shrunk to scattered battalions with only their rifles remaining. Volkssturm units, boys barely 14 and men over 60, marched with outdated weapons from the last war. Behind them poured the rest: construction battalions, Luftwaffe ground crews with no aircraft left, Kriegsmarine personnel whose ports had fallen, female auxiliaries terrified of falling into Soviet hands. American analysts estimated 1.2 million German military personnel remained east of the Elbe on April 25. Only a fraction remained in organized formations. The rest had dissolved into a human wave pushing westward. And the clock was ticking. Soviet armor could advance 50 kilometers a day, while Germans on foot could barely manage half that speed. On April 20th, the situation took a fateful turn. General Walther Wenck, commander of the 12th Army, received Hitler's last demand: launch a rescue assault on Berlin. Wenck looked at the order, then issued a completely different one. Instead of marching east to die in a hopeless attack, He gathered his officers and declared, "The war is lost. Our duty now is to the living, not to a dead ideology. We attack, but west, toward the Americans." It was a decision that would save hundreds of thousands. Wenck's intelligence officer, Colonel Gunther Reichhelm, had compiled reports from East Prussia so horrifying that they defied belief: mass killings, starvation, reprisals. If applied to the millions still trapped between the Soviets and the Elbe, the human cost would be unimaginable. By April 24, American forward observers began reporting extraordinary scenes. German armored vehicles driving with headlights on, ignoring basic combat precautions. Infantry marching in parade order. Officers saluting before requesting surrender. These were not broken remnants. They were intact units making a deliberate, rational choice. Captain Robert Thornton of the 2nd Armored Division radioed, "They are approaching with white flags. Entire units, officers included, are requesting surrender." And then in days, the trickle became a flood. Between April 24 and 26, the U.S. 9th Army processed tens of thousands of Germans who were not captured in battle. They were presenting themselves voluntarily after fighting their own blocking units to reach the Americans. Radio intercepts revealed German commanders speaking with disbelief. "Americans feed prisoners. Medical treatment confirmed. Geneva Convention observed." For an army that had been starving for months, those words spread like wildfire. But reaching the American lines meant surviving the fanatics. SS blocking detachments still held authority to shoot retreating soldiers. Checkpoints along westbound roads turned back desperate men. In some cases, retreaters were executed on the spot. Even in collapse, the SS fought with suicidal zeal, seeing surrender as treason. The cost of escape was blood, especially in the Halbe pocket, where the remnants of the German 9th Army fought through swamps, forests, and Soviet ambushes. Soviet rocket barrages detonated among columns packed with civilians. Aircraft strafed anything that moved. Entire families were wiped out trying to slip through forest paths that had become death traps. Of the 200,000 who attempted the breakout, only 40,000 reached Wenck's corridor. Tens of thousands more were captured or killed. The rest simply vanished into the killing fields of the Spree forest. Those who survived pushed desperately toward the Elbe, toward that broken bridge, toward the only hope they believed remained: American captivity. General Walther Wenck's 12th Army now carried a responsibility far beyond military duty. What began as a tactical withdrawal had turned into one of the largest humanitarian operations of the Second World War. With Soviet armor closing in from the east and the Elbe River blocking escape to the west, Wenck's forces, the last coherent German army in the field, became a lifeline for hundreds of thousands. His headquarters, set inside a schoolhouse near Furk, no longer looked like a military command post. Maps were covered in pencil markings showing roads clogged with refugees, dwindling ammunition dumps, and medical stations running on fumes. Officers moved through hallways that echoed with the sobs of civilians, the shuffling of wounded soldiers, and the constant ringing of telephones bringing news of fresh Soviet breakthroughs. Wenck's staff worked without sleep. The general had issued a simple directive: hold the corridor open. Every hour counts. Refugees streamed through in unending waves, an estimated 500,000 civilians, plus remnants of more than 20 German divisions. Many had marched for days on nothing but water and hope. Food meant for Wenck's own troops was handed to starving children and elderly civilians. Medical units, already low on supplies, performed amputations and battlefield surgeries with whatever tools they had left. Lieutenant Hans Mullmann, one of Wenck's operations officers, recalled looking at their remaining ammunition reports. 2 days at most, if the Soviets pressed hard. But those 2 days were everything. Enough time for tens of thousands more to escape. Wenck's tactical genius became evident. Instead of forming a traditional continuous front, he planted strong points at key road junctions and villages, forcing Soviet forces to deploy fully instead of simply overrunning exhausted defenders. Each strong point delayed the Soviets just long enough for another column of refugees to pass through the corridor. By May 4, the destroyed Tangermünde Bridge, a twisted skeleton of steel and concrete blown by German engineers weeks earlier, became the focal point of the entire exodus. It was the last crossing left. From the eastern bank came the German masses. From the western bank, American forces hurried to reinforce the fractured structure, working beside German engineers. The rivalry that had shaped 6 years of warfare dissolved into a single shared objective: keep the bridge open long enough to save lives. The scenes around the crossing defied the imagination. German colonels arrived with their entire regimental staffs and formally surrendered their colors. An SS general, still wearing full-dress uniform, approached the Americans with trembling hands and requested honorable captivity for his men. Naval officers led companies of sailors carrying nothing but sea bags and outdated pistols. Female auxiliaries clutched their papers, terrified of the fate awaiting them if the Soviets reached them first. The civilians were the most heartbreaking. Families pushed wheelbarrows containing everything they owned. Children who'd been separated from their parents were passed hand to hand across collapsed girders. Doctors wheeled wounded patients across the mangled span on their hospital beds, refusing to flee without them. Old men who could no longer walk were carried by strangers who'd met them only hours before. Master Sergeant James Patterson of the 102nd Infantry Division wrote, "They came in waves, day and night, unstoppable. Soldiers with rifles. Grandmothers leaning on sticks. Teenagers in Volkssturm armbands. Women carrying newborns wrapped in blankets made from uniforms. None wanted salvation, only survival." The flow grew so massive that American administrative systems collapsed. Geneva Convention procedures, paperwork, documentation, identification became impossible. At one point, 20,000 people arrived within a single day. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, Chief of Staff of 18 Airborne Corps, made the only humane decision possible. Forget the forms. Feed them. Treat the wounded. We can document later, if there's a later. American field kitchens fired nonstop. Delousing stations ran through the night. Medical tents overflowed with people suffering from exposure, infection, and starvation. Doctors described wounds untreated for weeks, bones exposed, shrapnel embedded, infections running to the bone. Children collapsed from hunger. Women carried scars of violence. Soldiers arrived with trench foot so advanced they had to be carried on stretchers made from torn coats and rifle slings. The supply crisis hit a peak on May 5. American rations intended for 15,000 troops were being consumed by over 60,000 Germans daily. Convoys arrived in endless lines. C-47 aircraft dropped food by parachute. The famed Red Ball Express, once used to fuel Patton's charge across France, was restarted solely to feed surrendering enemies. And still they came. For many, reaching the western bank meant life. Standing on the eastern bank meant a coin toss with death. The fate of millions now hinged on a single shattered bridge, and the race was only getting faster. By May 6, the fragile bridge at Tangermünde had become a living artery pumping humanity westward. Every step across its warped steel beams was a gamble, one misstep away from plunging into the Elbe below. But the line never stopped. Daylight, moonlight, artillery flashes on the horizon, it didn't matter. Tens of thousands crossed because stopping meant falling into Soviet hands. On the eastern bank, the distant rumble of Soviet artillery grew louder with each hour. At times, the ground shook as shells landed less than a kilometer away. Smoke drifted above the tree line, and the thunder of tank engines echoed closer. American officers standing on the western bank saw the urgency in every face that emerged from the trees. Raw fear mixed with exhaustion, a look that needed no translation. The German collapse had become complete. Units that once prided themselves on immaculate uniforms and parade ground discipline now arrived in mud-caked remnants, moving as scattered groups, not divisions. Officers carried nothing but sidearms, often discarded at the first sight of American MPs. Soldiers who had survived years of battles, Kursk, Sicily, Normandy, the Ardennes, now surrendered without a word, as if the war had drained the very language from them. The most haunting were the wounded dragged across the bridge by friends or strangers. Some had been limping for days on shattered ankles. Others had bullets still lodged in their bodies, wrapped in cloth torn from shirts and bedsheets. A medic from the U.S. 330th Medical Battalion described one man who had walked 30 kilometers with a broken femur, supported by 2 civilians who refused to leave him to Soviet captivity. Soviet pressure intensified, and the corridor began to shrink. The 12th Army's rear guard, already running perilously short on ammunition, fought desperate holding actions at crossroads and riverbanks. Every stand they made bought minutes that meant hundreds more civilians and soldiers could reach the crossing. Near the village of Perry, Wenck's armored detachment launched its final counterattack. 7 remaining Panther tanks, scraped together from battered workshops, rolled into firing positions. Their commanders knew they would not return. They were not fighting for Berlin or the Reich. They were fighting to buy time for people they'd never met. When the Soviets broke through, the Panthers were destroyed one by one. But the delay allowed another massive refugee column to reach the Elbe. By May 7th, the bridge had transformed into an organized miracle of cooperation. On the eastern approach, German officers directed traffic with clipped efficiency, barking orders that held the constantly surging mass in some semblance of order. On the western side, American MPs kept the flood moving, separating soldiers from civilians, providing water, guiding stretcher cases, catching children who stumbled. At one point, American engineers radioed higher command requesting immediate reinforcement. The remaining beams were beginning to bow from the weight of so many feet. Crews laid wooden planks across gaps and used steel cables to stabilize sections that threatened to give way entirely. A U.S. officer later wrote, "That bridge should have collapsed. Physics said it should have failed. But somehow it didn't. It was as if the will of the people crossing it held up the steel." The faces crossing the Elbe told 1,000 stories. Some whispered, some wept, others carried in silence. Women with bruises that needed no explanation. Children barefoot, too tired to cry. Old men who had fought in the First World War, now carried across the river they once defended. Nurses who had refused to abandon their patients. Young Hitler Youth boys who looked at American soldiers with confused eyes, unsure whether to fear or hope. And among them appeared those who had never imagined they would one day surrender to their enemy. A group of SS men approached, stripped of insignia and weapons, hands raised. Their commander carried a wounded soldier on his back. The Americans made no distinction. They sent both to the medical tent. A Luftwaffe pilot, still wearing part of his flight suit, limped forward with a bloodied map folded in his hand. When asked where he had come from, he simply pointed behind him and whispered, "East, you don't want to know." On the second day of the crossing, a German officer arrived with a baby in his arms, the child barely a few months old. The officer had found the infant crying beside the body of its mother somewhere along the road. He had carried the child for 40 kilometers to make sure it didn't fall into Soviet hands. The Americans took both into custody, the baby surviving because a stranger decided to keep walking despite the chaos behind him. The psychological contrast between the two armies could not have been sharper. Across the river, the Soviet artillery continued creeping forward, each blast sending fear through the refugee columns. On the American side, soldiers offered cigarettes, canteens of water, and blankets torn from their own bedrolls. One American private wrote to his parents, "We were supposed to be their enemy. But today, it felt like we were their only hope left in the world." Throughout May 7th, the crossing never stopped. Not for darkness, not for exhaustion, not for incoming fire. By nightfall, the numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands had made it across. And still the line stretched into the forests. The deadline loomed. Midnight on May 8th. After that hour, any German soldiers who crossed risked forced repatriation to Soviet captivity. The most frantic surge was still yet to come. As May 8th dawned, the urgency around the Tangermünde crossing intensified beyond anything the Americans had yet seen. Word had spread like wildfire. The ceasefire would take effect at 23:01 hours. After that, anyone crossing risked forced return to Soviet hands. It was no longer a movement. It was a race against time, and every man, woman, and child on the eastern bank knew the stakes. Columns that had been orderly the day before now became a swelling tide. The distant thunder of Soviet artillery grew louder with each hour. Many could see the smoke of burning villages at the tree line. For the first time, Soviet reconnaissance units were spotted less than 5 kilometers away. The corridor would collapse within hours. American officers realized the situation was turning into a human stampede. They widened their intake area, deployed additional MPs, and placed extra medics along the riverbank. Field kitchens that had already served tens of thousands began doubling their output, boiling soup in giant cauldrons as fast as they could refill them. A U.S. engineer captain wrote in his report, "We were no longer processing prisoners. We were pulling people out of a tidal wave." German discipline, shattered only weeks earlier, re-emerged in the chaos. Officers restored order at the bridge approach, using whistles, shouted commands, and even hand signals to keep thousands moving in a controlled line. Soldiers who had fought in Stalingrad, Normandy, and the Ardennes now used their battlefield experience simply to manage civilians. Some carried the elderly on chairs or makeshift stretchers. Others lifted children over their heads, passing them toward the front of the line. At the bottleneck, even wounded soldiers stepped aside, pushing civilians ahead of them. Surrender was no longer about honor, it was about ensuring someone else survived. Throughout the morning, German rearguard units continued delaying actions east of the river. Wenck's remaining tanks, now little more than smoking hulks, had been lost in the night. What remained of the 12th Army fought as small pockets scattered through the forest, firing until their ammunition ran out. Their orders had not changed: buy time for the refugees. By midday, Soviet shells were landing close enough that shrapnel struck the riverbank. American units responded instinctively. Artillery crews from the 102nd Division shifted their guns and fired counter-battery rounds, not to support German defense but to shield the civilians rushing toward the crossing. It was a moment when two armies still officially at war acted together against a common danger. Refugees screamed as shells exploded in the trees. The smell of burning timber mixed with the dust of collapsing roofs. Horses bolted and overturned carts. Some civilians dropped their belongings, choosing speed over possessions. A young girl stumbled and fell through a gap in the bridge. Without hesitation, an American sergeant scrambled onto the beam, crawled underneath, and pulled her back to safety. When she reached the western bank, she pressed a small wooden toy into his hand as thanks before disappearing into the crowd. Near sunset, a strange figure emerged from the mass. A Luftwaffe officer with a bloodied bandage wrapped around his head, leading a group of wounded on bicycles rigged together like stretchers. He saluted the American MPs, then collapsed from exhaustion. Before losing consciousness, he whispered, "Please, don't send them east." They assured him he was safe. By early evening, the flow became a surge. The last organized German formations were arriving, remnants of panzer battalions, artillery crews, Volkssturm elements, and thousands of support personnel who had marched for days. Many still carried weapons, which they stacked in towering piles as soon as they stepped onto American ground. The piles of surrendered rifles, machine guns, and mortars grew into heaps so high that engineers used bulldozers to push them aside. Yet it still wasn't enough to keep the path clear. The war had produced these weapons. Now the people were discarding them as if eager to be rid of every trace of it. By 2100 hours, the scene reached its peak. The sky glowed orange from burning villages behind them. The rumble of Soviet tanks grew distinct. The crowd no longer murmured. It breathed in one steady, trembling rhythm, each person aware they were minutes from salvation or disaster. A Volkssturm soldier, no older than 16, arrived with his grandfather. The boy had been conscripted in March. The old man had fought in the First World War. They crossed together, the child shaking, the grandfather barely able to walk. As they reached the American lines, the boy started sobbing uncontrollably, the first tears he had allowed himself since being handed a rifle. At 22:30, the final rush came. Thousands still remained on the eastern side. They had half an hour before the official ceasefire. The bridge shook under the weight. American engineers shouted warnings. Any more pressure and the beams might fail. But they didn't stop. The last few hundred meters of the eastern approach devolved into chaos. Soviet armor was close enough now that the ground trembled. Flares lit the tree line in a ghostly red. Shouts turned into screams. Officers tried to keep order but were overwhelmed as thousands pushed forward. At 22:47 hours, 14 minutes before the ceasefire, a gray-haired Volkssturm member staggered across the final planks. His uniform was torn, his boots were mismatched, and he carried nothing but a photograph of his grandchildren. When an American MP asked why he kept moving even when he could barely stand, the old man replied simply, "I want to live long enough to see them again." He made it. Many behind him did not. The crossing officially closed at 23:01, but the echoes of the last desperate footsteps lingered long after. For those who reached the American lines, survival had been won by minutes, sometimes seconds. When the ceasefire took effect at 23:01 hours on May 8, the exhausted soldiers of the 102nd Infantry Division finally ordered the Tangermünde crossing closed. The bridge that had carried more than 100,000 souls in 3 days fell silent at last, its twisted iron skeleton still trembling from the final desperate surge. Darkness settled over the Elbe, broken only by the glow of burning villages to the east. On the western bank, thousands of Germans sat or lay on the ground, too tired to speak, too stunned to comprehend what they had survived. Some stared at the sky as if expecting the next order to fall from the clouds. Others simply fell asleep where they stood, their bodies collapsing after days of fear-driven endurance. American soldiers moved quietly among them, offering blankets, water, and whatever food they had left in their packs. The field kitchens ran through the night, producing simple meals that tasted like salvation. Long lines of prisoners waited patiently, many whispering, "Danke," through cracked lips. For the first time in years, they were safe from artillery, air raids, and the dread of the Eastern Front. But the work for the Americans was only beginning. By morning, the western bank of the river had transformed into a temporary city, tens of thousands of surrendered troops and civilians spread across fields and roads, each requiring food, shelter, medical care, and documentation. The scale dwarfed every previous surrender in the West. Men approached American officers carrying surrendered flags, folded documents, and even entire battle diaries. Columns of soldiers marched in formation toward the processing areas, maintaining discipline out of habit rather than necessity. Others arrived alone, dazed, separated from their units and families in the chaos of their flight. The medical tents overflowed immediately. The worst cases were carried in first: gangrenous wounds, malnourished children, women with injuries from assault, soldiers who had walked on broken bones for days. American medics worked without rest, treating enemy wounded as if they were their own. Some surgeries were performed in open-air stations, with stretchers placed in long rows under improvised canvas roofs. Captain David Miller later wrote that the scene felt less like a military camp and more like a disaster relief zone. "We were supposed to fight Germany," he noted. "Instead, we were saving what was left of it." Not all stories ended in survival. Some men died minutes after reaching safety, too weak, too wounded, too far gone. American chaplains and German officers conducted joint burial rites, standing side by side as enemy dead were laid to rest with whatever dignity could be offered. As the days passed, the full magnitude of the surrender became clear. The arriving tide slowed but did not stop. Even after the deadline, stragglers continued to emerge, some wounded, some hiding in barns or forests, some having escaped Soviet transport columns. Many arrived after the official cutoff but were accepted anyway by American soldiers who couldn't bring themselves to turn them away. By May 15th, American forces in the region had processed more than 1 million German military personnel. The 102nd Division alone accounted for over 300,000, more than the entire German army that invaded Poland in 1939. The camps filled rapidly. Temporary enclosures, little more than open fields ringed with barbed wire, held tens of thousands. Conditions were harsh, but for those who had fled the Eastern Front, it was a world away from what awaited in Soviet captivity. Death rates remained low, injuries were treated, and food was distributed daily. The fear that had driven their flight began to fade. In the weeks that followed, the stories of those final days along the Elbe spread across Germany. The American soldiers who shared water from their own canteens, the engineers who kept the bridge standing long after it should have collapsed, the medics who saved wounded that had been abandoned in the chaos of retreat. For many Germans, this experience would become a defining memory, shaping post-war perceptions of America and laying the foundation for a future alliance between former enemies. Veterans spoke of it to their children and grandchildren. And those children grew up in a Germany that looked west, not east, for its reconstruction and democratic rebirth. General Walther Wenck, whose decision to defy Hitler saved hundreds of thousands, survived the war. When asked decades later whether he regretted retreating west instead of fighting for Berlin, he answered simply, "A commander's duty is to protect life, not sacrifice it for a corpse." His soldiers never forgot him. Others remembered small acts of mercy, a piece of bread, a cigarette shared across enemy lines, an MP lifting a collapsing refugee onto his feet, a medic kneeling beside a dying man and holding his hand so he wouldn't leave the world alone. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, who had stood guard along the crossing, later summed up the experience with words that captured the essence of those days. "They weren't surrendering to us. They were running from death. We just happened to be the side that still believed in mercy." By the end of May, the Elbe crossing had taken its place in the vast mosaic of World War II's final moments, not as a battle, but as one of the most extraordinary humanitarian events in military history. A moment when enemies laid down their weapons, not because they were beaten, but because they recognized the one path left that might give them a future. The shattered bridge remained twisted and broken, never rebuilt. But in memory, it became a symbol of a desperate flight, of a choice between two fates, and of the simple fact that in the darkest hours of war, humanity can still prevail. For the hundreds of thousands who crossed the Elbe, those bent beams and splintered planks represented not just escape, but the narrow line between life and death. And for generations afterward, they would remember one truth above all. Sometimes victory is measured not in enemies destroyed, but in lives saved,